The Strait of Hormuz at 3 a.m. is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. That is not very wide for a body of water that carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply through its passage every day. And it is especially not very wide for a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier whose flight deck alone spans nearly 4 acres and whose full displacement puts her in a category of object that does not fit comfortably inside anything that is only 21 miles across. The USS Nimitz had transited the strait dozens of times in her operational life. Her crew knew the passage. They knew the Iranian coastline on the northern side and the Omani coastline on the southern side and the specific radar and sensor picture that the strait produced at every hour of the day and night. They knew what belonged in that picture and what did not. At 3 a.m. on this particular morning, what belonged in the picture was the ordinary commercial traffic of one of the world's busiest shipping corridors and the standard patrol posture of the strike group's escorts moving in their assigned positions around the carrier. What did not belong in the picture arrived at 3:07 a.m. The E-2D Hawkeye had been holding its orbit at altitude over the southern approach to the strait for 4 hours. Its crew had been tracking the commercial traffic picture with the methodical attention that airborne early warning work requires and had been maintaining the communications discipline that the strike group's emissions control posture demanded. The radar officer had been watching a cluster of surface contacts on the northern approach since 2:51 a.m., contacts that had initially been assessed as a group of fishing vessels moving southeast along the Iranian coastal shelf. The assessment had been correct at 2:51 a.m. By 3:07 a.m., it was no longer correct, and the radar officer knew it was no longer correct because the contacts had changed their behavior in a way that fishing vessels do not change their behavior at 3 in the morning in the middle of a shipping lane. They had accelerated, not gradually, simultaneously. 16 contacts, moving in a pattern that the radar officer's display resolved over the course of 40 seconds of track processing as a coordinated geometric formation rather than the random clustering of independent vessels. The formation was spreading as it accelerated, its contacts fanning out from a compressed launch cluster into a broader frontage that the radar officer recognized from his mission briefings with the specific clarity of recognition that good preparation produces. He had been briefed on this. The formation geometry, the simultaneous acceleration, the bearing toward the carrier strike group's position. He transmitted his contact report to the strike group's Combat Information Center aboard the Nimitz at 3:08 a.m., 14 seconds after the behavior change had become unambiguous. 14 seconds was fast enough. The Combat Information Center of a nuclear aircraft carrier during a threat event is not a loud place. It is a controlled place. The overhead lighting shifts. The display picture refreshes. The operators at their consoles run the assessment protocols they have run in simulation hundreds of times, and the watch officers move through the space with the particular economy of motion that high-stakes environments produce in people who have been trained to function in them. The strike group's anti-air warfare coordinator received the E-2D's contact report and had the threat tracks displayed on the CIC's main screen within 90 seconds of the radar officer's transmission. The tracks were not ambiguous. 16 surface contacts, accelerating on a bearing that converged on the Nimitz's position in approximately 18 minutes, moving in a formation pattern consistent with a coordinated maritime drone strike. The anti-air warfare coordinator called the assessment to the admiral commanding the strike group in 4 words. The admiral acknowledged in 2. The strike group's escorts had been in their standard positions. The USS Stockdale, A guided missile destroyer was operating on the Nimitz's northern flank, the side from which the contacts were approaching. The USS Princeton, a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, was positioned 2 nautical miles ahead of the carrier on the primary threat axis. Both ships had their own radar pictures, and both ships had been tracking the same contact cluster that the E-2D had flagged, their surface search radars resolving the individual contacts with increasing clarity as the range decreased and the contacts' radar cross-sections became more distinct. The officer of the deck aboard the Stockdale had already gone to action stations before the strike group's threat warning reached him. He had seen the same picture. He had reached the same conclusion. He had not waited for the order that was coming because the order was obvious and the time margin was not generous. The Princeton's combat systems officer had her weapon systems at readiness status within 4 minutes of the initial contact report. The cruiser's radar picture was excellent at this range. She could see all 16 contacts clearly. She could track them precisely. The engagement solution her systems were building was accurate. What the engagement solution had to account for was the geometry of the strait itself. The northern coastline from which the contacts had launched was 13 nautical miles from the Nimitz's current position. The contacts were running at speeds that her surface search radar was now characterizing as between 40 and 55 knots. Maritime drones at those speeds in a formation of this density, covering the approach distance that the geometry described, presented an engagement timeline that the Princeton's combat systems officer had run through her mental math twice before she reported it to the admiral. The timeline was workable. It was not comfortable. The margin between first engagement opportunity and the point at which the first contacts would enter the standoff range of their likely payload was measured in minutes and would not expand. The admiral authorized weapons free on the surface contacts at 3:11 a.m. The Princeton's forward gun system opened first, its radar-directed fire laying a pattern of rounds across the lead contact's approach track at maximum effective range. The first 2 contacts in the formation's lead element ceased moving within seconds of the first rounds reaching their position. The gun system's rate of fire and the precision of its radar guidance were functioning exactly as designed. What was also functioning exactly as designed was the Iranian drone formation's response to the opening engagement. The formation did not scatter. It compressed. The contacts on the outer edges of the fan accelerated and turned inward, reducing their mutual spacing and presenting a denser cluster to the Princeton's gun system, a cluster in which the overlapping radar returns of closely spaced contacts began to create tracking resolution problems that the gun system's fire control computer was managing, but managing with decreasing margin as the range continued to close. The Stockdale engaged from the north, her own weapon system opening against the contacts on the formation's right flank. The tactical picture in the Nimitz's CIC was showing 5 contacts neutralized, 11 remaining, at ranges that the anti-air warfare coordinator was calling aloud at 30-second intervals. The F/A-18F crews that had been on 5-minute alert on the Nimitz's flight deck had been scrambled at 3:10 a.m. and were now airborne. 2 aircraft turning north toward the engagement area at speeds that would bring them into weapons employment range against the remaining contacts in approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes was the number the tactical action officer was working with. 4 minutes and the geometry held. 4 minutes and the gun systems and the incoming aircraft together had the engagement coverage to address the remaining 11 contacts before any of them reached the standoff release point for their payloads. At 3:16 a.m., the geometry changed. The E-2D crew, holding their orbit and maintaining continuous radar coverage of the entire threat picture, detected a second launch event on the Iranian coast. Not maritime drones this time. The radar return was airborne. Small, fast, and low. The radar officer processed the track for 11 seconds before he reported it, because 11 seconds of track data was what he needed to confirm what he was seeing was not a surface contact in ground clutter. It was not a surface contact. It was an airborne contact. Multiple airborne contacts. 8 of them flying in a terrain masking profile along the Iranian coastline's radar shadow, using the elevation of the coastal terrain to suppress their radar cross-section against the strike group's surface radars. They had not been visible to the surface radars. They were visible to the E-2D, whose altitude gave its radar a look-down geometry that the terrain masking could not defeat. The E-2D radar officer's second contact report reached the CIC at 3:17 a.m. The anti-air warfare coordinator had the new tracks on his display within seconds. 8 airborne contacts bearing northwest, altitude low, speed consistent with subsonic cruise missiles or large-armed drones. Closing. The Princeton's anti-air radar had already acquired 3 of the contacts as they cleared the coastal terrain's masking effect and entered the cruiser's unobstructed radar coverage. The combat systems officer called her weapon solutions. The contacts were within range of the Princeton Standard missile batteries. The engagement geometry was viable. She requested authorization and received it in the same transmission. The first Standard missile left the Princeton's vertical launch system at 3:18 a.m. The hydraulic thud of the launch traveled through the ship's hull and into the deck plates of every compartment aboard, in the specific way that a VLS launch always does. A physical fact about the world that no amount of prior exposure makes entirely routine, because it carries with it the weight of what the launch represents. The missile climbed clear of the ship's superstructure, its exhaust plume visible from the bridge in the darkness for the seconds before it turned onto its intercept heading, and the light of it diminished as it accelerated away. The officer on the bridge watched it go and then looked back at the tactical display. The display was the thing that mattered now. The missile would do what it had been designed to do. The display would tell him whether it had. The first airborne contact ceased to exist as a coherent radar return at 3:18 a.m. and 43 seconds. The Princeton's combat systems officer noted it without expression and shifted her attention to the second contact, whose solution her system had been computing in parallel throughout the first missile's flight. The rate at which the system cycled through solutions and launches was determined by the physics of the engagement geometry and the processing architecture of the fire control system, and both were performing within their specified parameters. The Princeton was doing what a Ticonderoga-class cruiser was built to do. She was built to do exactly this. The surface contacts were still approaching. The F/A-18Fs had entered the engagement area and were employing against the maritime drone formation from altitude, their targeting systems resolving the individual contacts with a clarity that the surface ship's gun systems, operating in a cluttered sea surface radar environment, could not fully match. The air crews worked through their weapons employment with the controlled speed of people who understand that the engagement timeline is fixed and that understanding is the correct frame for the speed at which they are working. 4 more contacts were removed from the formation in the first 90 seconds of aircraft employment. 7 remaining. 6. The Princeton's gun system accounted for another. 5 maritime contacts and 5 airborne contacts remained in the engagement picture at 3:21 a.m. when the Stockdale's anti-air warfare officer reported a system anomaly. The ship's forward gun system had experienced a jam in its ammunition feed mechanism. The jam was not catastrophic. It was the kind of mechanical friction that high rate of fire systems experience under sustained operational load, the kind of failure that the system's design philosophy had been built around by assuming it would eventually happen and providing a manual clearing procedure. The clearing procedure required a trained gunner's mate to physically access the feed mechanism and clear the obstruction. The procedure took between 90 seconds and 3 minutes, depending on the specific nature of the obstruction. During those 90 seconds to 3 minutes, the Stockdale's primary close-in engagement capability was degraded. The 5 remaining maritime contacts were in the sector the Stockdale had been covering. The Stockdale's commanding officer did not wait for the gun to be cleared. He turned his ship. He brought the Stockdale to a heading that placed the contact sector within the engagement arc of his missile systems and authorized the engagement of the remaining surface contacts with missiles whose employment against maritime drone targets at close range was not their designed primary mission, but whose guidance systems and warhead configurations were adequate to the task at the ranges now involved. The first missile engagement against a surface maritime drone contact produced a result that the combat systems officer evaluated in real time as effective. The second and third followed. 2 maritime contacts remained. The FA-18Fs, having cleared the formation's northern element, turned south and found the last 2 contacts. Both air crews employed. Both contacts were removed from the picture at 3:24 a.m. The airborne contacts were still being engaged. The Princeton had accounted for 4 of the 8. The 5th had been engaged and lost its coherent radar return, but had not been confirmed destroyed. It had descended below the E-2D's radar coverage altitude and was no longer being tracked. The anti-air warfare coordinator reported the unconfirmed contact to the Admiral at 3:23 a.m. The Admiral acknowledged and directed the E-2D crew to attempt reacquisition, while the Princeton's radar continued searching the contact's last known track. The unconfirmed contact was reacquired at 3:25 a.m., 3 nautical miles northwest of its last confirmed position, at an altitude that placed it below the cruiser's standard missile engagement envelope at the remaining range. The CIC's threat assessment resolved it as a contact that had descended to a sea-skimming profile, following a guidance malfunction or an electronic warfare effect from the Princeton's onboard jamming systems that had been running throughout the engagement. Running at sea-skimming altitude and no longer tracking, the contact impacted the water at 3:26 a.m. without reaching the strike group. The Princeton's crew confirmed the impact splash on radar. The remaining 3 airborne contacts were engaged and removed from the picture by 3:29 a.m. The engagement was complete. The strike group's picture showed no remaining active threats. What was not yet complete was the mission's second phase. The E-2D crew had been maintaining track on the Iranian coastal position from which both the maritime drone formation and the airborne contacts had been launched. The position had been resolved to a precision of approximately 200 meters over the course of the engagement, its radar and emission signatures providing enough geometric data to build a targeting solution that the strike group's tactical network had been refining in real time since 3:08 a.m. The position was a coastal facility. Its surface infrastructure was consistent with what overhead imagery of similar Iranian maritime strike coordination positions had shown in previous collection. The facility had been active throughout the engagement, its communications and radar emissions visible to the E-2D's passive collection suite and to the electronic warfare systems aboard the Princeton, which had been recording everything the facility transmitted since the engagement opened. The admiral authorized the strike at 3:31 a.m. The two FA-18Fs that had been employed in the engagement had sufficient fuel and ordnance remaining for the strike tasking. They received the targeting data from the E-2D via the strike group's tactical data link and turned north toward the Iranian coast. The approach profile was low and fast. The coastal facility's own radar, whose emissions the Princeton had been monitoring continuously, was still active. The facility's operators had been watching the engagement. They understood what had happened to the assets they had launched. They were now understanding something else. The FA-18Fs employed their standoff weapons at 3:34 a.m. from a range that kept the aircraft outside the engagement envelope of any air defense system the intelligence assessment had associated with the facility. The weapons ran their terminal approach profiles and reached the facility at 3:36 a.m. The strike group's radar and the E-2D's passive collection suite monitored the facility's emissions until 3:36 a.m. and then monitored the absence of those emissions. The facility's radar had stopped transmitting. The communications suite had stopped transmitting. The Princeton's electronic warfare officer reported the cessation to the CIC. The anti-air warfare coordinator logged the time. The Nimitz had maintained her course and speed throughout the engagement. Her flight deck had launched additional aircraft to support the engagement and the strike. Those aircraft were now recovering aboard, their crews completing the post-flight procedures that follow any employment event, and that mark, in the structured routine of carrier aviation, the transition from the engagement that has just happened to the readiness posture for the engagement that has not yet happened but must be prepared for with the same rigor. The flight deck crews worked in the organized urgency that carrier flight operations always produce, and the aircraft that had been launched and recovered were being refueled and rearmed to the posture that the strike group's readiness requirements specified. The Princeton's gun system was repaired at 3:41 a.m. The gunner's mate, who had cleared the ammunition feed obstruction, reported the system back to operational status. The system was tested through its automated checks and confirmed ready. The Princeton resumed her position in the strike group formation. The Stockdale had expended a significant portion of her close-in missile inventory in the engagement. Her commanding officer reported the expenditure to the strike group's logistics coordinator and received acknowledgement that a replenishment cycle would be scheduled at the earliest practicable opportunity. Expenditure was not a failure. Expenditure was the evidence that the system had worked. The weapons that the Stockdale had launched had performed the function they had been built and maintained and trained against and funded to perform. The inventory was the cost of that performance. The cost was acceptable. The Nimitz cleared the Strait of Hormuz at 4:44 a.m. and entered the Arabian Sea. The transit was complete. The strike group reassumed its standard formation, and the watch rotations resumed their normal cycle. The flight deck continued its operations. The CIC maintained its continuous radar picture. The E-2D crew that had been on station since before the engagement handed off to a relief crew at 5 a.m. and returned to the carrier. 47 minutes. 16 maritime contacts. 8 airborne contacts. 2 naval vessels with degraded systems that were repaired before the strait was cleared. 2 F/A-18F crews. 1 coastal facility that had launched both waves and would not launch again. 0 damage to the Nimitz or her escorts beyond the Stockdale's ammunition feed jam and the expenditure of weapons that the engagement had required. The strait was behind them. The Arabian Sea was ahead. The Nimitz had passed through this strait before. She would pass through it again. Each time she did, she carried with her the accumulated weight of every system, every crew member, and every decision that had been made in the years and decades that had built the force that had just done what it had needed to do in 47 minutes of darkness over 21 miles of contested water. The strait is a choke point. So is every place where power is tested. The carrier group does not wait for the choke point to open. It makes the choke point irrelevant by being exactly what it is. The ocean ahead was wide and the mission continued. Nothing that tried to stop the Nimitz tonight had succeeded. Nothing that tries to stop her ever does.